Holy Fathers, dear friends, the Metropolitan has already referred to the conference that took place here in 2015, and the paper that I'm going to read is the one that Metropolitan Kallistos actually delivered at that conference. I might begin, though, perhaps as he did, with a story which is not included in the published text, and it was a story about me. Perhaps you'll recall it if you were there. I'll speak in his voice. He said, a couple of nights ago I had a dream, and I dreamt that Graham and I were travelling together to the Holy Mountain. And when we embarked on the ferry in Metropolitan, I noticed that he was carrying a large suitcase. I thought this was rather unusual, because normally if you were going to the Holy Mountain you travel light and you take perhaps a small rucksack. So I was a bit curious to know what was inside the suitcase. Anyway, when we got to Daphne, which is the port of Athos, there was a customs inspection. This doesn't actually normally happen, but anyway, in the dream it did happen, apparently. And the customs officer asked Graham to open his suitcase. And it contained 17 pairs of shoes. And Graham was asked to pay duty on this, and he was not pleased. But later I asked him why he had brought so many shoes. And he replied, I intend to do a lot of walking. A lot of walking, that's what pilgrimage on the Holy Mountain is all about. Now I shall turn to the Metropolitan's text. Among all the sacred places on this earth, the Holy Mountain of Athos is the one that I personally find most immediately attractive. Since my first visit in 1961, I've been drawn back to the Mountain of Monks more frequently than I can now remember, perhaps some 15 times, possibly more often. With good reason, Athos has been styled the monastic magnet, and certainly its magnetic force is something I have felt continually since my initial pilgrimage 54 years ago, and indeed for a number of years before that. During those 54 years, what have I come to understand about the inner meaning and the spiritual message of the Holy Mountain? What changes have I seen? What have I come to regard as its contribution to the wider community of the outside world, throughout the Church as a whole, and indeed beyond its boundaries? We know that when any one of us falls, he falls alone, states Alexei Komyakov, but no one is saved alone. How then do the monks of Athos contribute to the salvation of others? Let me begin with what has been for me the single most memorable experience on the Holy Mountain, when I ascended alone during the night to the summit of Athos in summer 1971. My intention was to reach the peak at sunrise. I was about to set out from St. Anne's around 10 p.m. when there was a sudden and violent fall of rain, and I wondered if it might be prudent to postpone my journey. Go, said Father Elias, the monk with whom I was staying. You may not ever again have another such opportunity. And if you go, you will never forget your experience. I'm glad that I took his advice. In fact, there was no more rain that night. It was a lengthy climb. My starting point at St. Anne's was about 300 metres above sea level, but to reach the summit, I had to mount upwards for another 1,700 metres or more. I had chosen a night when there was a full moon, but in practice the moon was less helpful than I had expected, for I had forgotten that much of the walk was through the woods, where the moonlight could not penetrate. My immediate objective was the little chapel of the Panagia, about 500 meters below the summit, where I intended to rest before embarking on the final stages of the ascent. I came out from the woods into a rocky wilderness where the chapel ought to have been, but I couldn't see it anywhere. To make matters worse, I lost the path. Moonlight has the effect of flattening the landscape and making everything appear different. Blundering about in confusion for many minutes, eventually I sat down defeated. Then I looked up and saw, to my surprise, the chapel no more than 200 meters away. How strange that I had not noticed it before. After a short sleep on the chapel floor and a drink of cool water from the nearby cistern, I set out in the pale morning light for the peak of the Holy Mountain. The path is good, and there is no danger at all as long as one does not wander from it. But I kept in mind that not long before, 3 Germans had left the proper route and fallen to their deaths. I arrived at the summit just as I had hoped, at the exact moment when the sun emerged in the east from the low clouds across the sea. I was confronted by an astonishing spectacle. After gazing for some time at the rising at the sun in the east, I turned and looked northward and saw the whole Athonite Peninsula, thousands of meters below me, stretching away towards the mainland. It was like a relief map, with rocks and paths standing out with amazing clarity. I could distinguish all the paths that I had been following for the past 10 days, and even the exact points where I had missed the right turning. For in those days there were few effective signposts. Then, with my back to the rising sun, I looked westward, once more over the sea. The sight that met me was something I had never expected, and it would always remain etched in my memory. I saw the shadow of the Holy Mountain as a great pyramid of darkness, extending many miles over the sea, and shrinking perceptibly as the sun behind my back rose higher. Surely there are few places in the world where such a phenomenon can be seen. As I stood in this way, alone at sunrise, in the piercing cold on the top of Mount Athos, beside the then ruined chapel of the Transfiguration, I was given a dim inkling of the significance of the mountain as a holy sanctuary, as a point in sacred space, a thin place where the wall of partition between earth and heaven, between the present age and the age to come, becomes so attenuated as to be virtually transparent. I've begun these recollections of my visits to Athos over 54 years by speaking of the mountain itself, and this I've done for an important reason. Athos is indeed a mountain full of holy persons, of dedicated monks, and of this I shall speak in a moment. It's also a mountain full of holy objects, of churches and chapels, icons, relics, chalices, crosses, and illuminated gospel books. But beside all this, it is more fundamentally in itself a holy mountain. While admiring the saints and ascetics who have dwelt and still dwell there, and while rejoicing in the spiritual beauty of the many works of art that it contains, we need also to appreciate the physical reality of the mountain as such, the intrinsic sacredness of the material environment in which these persons and objects are to be found. In the words of Father Nikon, the hermit of Carulia, who inspired the English translation of the Diokleia, here every stone breathes prayers. In common with other holy places such as Jerusalem and Patmos, Iona and Walsingham, the holy mountain of Athos acts as a sacrament of God's presence, as a burning glass, concentrating the rays of the spiritual sun with an especial intensity, manifesting the immediacy of the eternal. To appreciate the physical reality, this intrinsic sacredness, the best way for the pilgrim is to travel on foot. Not to be driven in a minibus or Land Rover, but to walk, if possible, alone. This will frequently prove exhausting. The ancient mule paths are often steep, sometimes neglected, full of loose, sharp stones and overgrown with brambles. In summer, the pilgrim will inevitably suffer from heat and thirst, but only so will he come face to face with the basic reality of Athos as a centre of stillness, a shrine of the divine presence. Along with the holiness of the mountain, the pilgrim who travels on foot will also be struck by its outstanding natural beauty. Because of the presence of streams on every side and the absence of marauding goats, Athos, especially in springtime, is a veritable paradise. There are meadows bright with wildflowers and trees covered with blossom, and everywhere there is the surrounding sea, with waves breaking over the rocks. And Prince Mishkin's words come to mind in Dostoevsky's novel The Idiot: "Beauty will save the world." This Athonite beauty is not vacant and static, but it's full of sounds and movement. For the mountain is a refuge for many living creatures, non-human as well as human. On my earlier visits, as I set off to walk alone through the more remote uplands, the monks warned me to beware of the wolves. I never saw any, but doubtless they saw me, and as they looked watchfully from the thick undergrowth beside the paths, I'm told that there are now no more wolves on Athos, because they've all been shot. This is in some respects a pity. For wolves, in their own way, are hesychasts, seeking solitude and avoiding contact with humans. And so their continuing presence was an assurance that the mountain has not ceased to be a place of seclusion. While I have never seen any wolves on my Athonite wanderings, I have twice met wild boar. The first occasion was just outside the skeet of the prophet Elijah. The second was in the deserted region above the Serbian monastery of Hilandar, on the path leading to Kronica, close to the border with Uranuku. Here I encountered a whole family, father, mother, and two youngsters, not more than 50 meters away. All four of them stopped in their tracks and stared at me with curiosity and without apparent hostility. After I greeted them, they continued peacefully on their way, disappearing among the bushes. The solitary walker will also come across snakes, both great and small, which abound on the holy mountain. When I was staying for several weeks at Hilandar, working on the English translation of the Diokleia with my friends Gerald Palmer and Philip Sherrard, both frequent visitors to Athos, I used to go alone for a walk each afternoon in the surrounding woods. Every day, in exactly the same place on the path, I met a snake, some 3 meters long, basking in the sunshine. On the first day, I banged on the ground with my staff, but he showed no inclination to move until I had addressed him politely, asking him to let me through. Then he slid into a gap in the adjoining wall, but as soon as I had passed, I heard a swishing sound immediately behind me as he slid out once more to resume his place in the sun. On the second day, I had no need to bang on the ground, for as soon as I asked him, he moved out of the way. On the third day, I didn't even have to ask, much less to bang on the ground, for of his own accord he moved aside as soon as he saw me approaching. Such is the rapport with the realm of nature that even a town dweller such as myself can quickly establish during visits to the mountain. The monks who live there permanently, especially the hermits, frequently build up a relationship that is far closer. The many stories in monastic sources about beasts and saints are not mere legends. Not all my encounters with Athonite snakes have been as benign as my acquaintance with the snake of Lindau. Once, in one of the more solitary regions of the mountain, I heard nearby a strange sound, and I turned aside from the path to discover the cause. A rabbit had come down to the pool to drink, and a large water snake had seized hold of its head and was gradually swallowing it whole as the rabbit screamed aloud. I took note that it would be sensible not to bathe in isolated pools on the mountain. The monks may not eat meat, but there are other residents on Athos who do. I wondered at the time whether I should intervene to try and save the rabbit, but I decided that it was not my business to meddle in the affairs of Athonite wildlife. I bore in mind the experience of a friend of mine who was making his way through the woods on the mountain in the company of a monk. My friend has the ability to imitate bird song, and since the Athonite woods are full of birds, he practiced this gift as the two of them walked together. He called out to the birds, and the birds duly replied. In tones of disapproval, the monk said to him, "What are you doing that?" "Why, what's wrong?" asked my friend. And the monk replied severely, "You are disturbing the natural order." Along with the snakes and birds, Athos is home to innumerable frogs. I know few sounds in nature as attractive as the singing of frogs, and Athos is one of the best places in which to enjoy batrachian harmony. Once I was staying around the season of Pentecost at the Skeet of St. Anne's, and here each of the scattered dwellings has a garden with its own system and its own contingent of melodious frogs. As I sat on the balcony around sunset, first I could hear the frogs many meters below me on the steep hillside, and then came an answering group many meters above. Others joined in from various systems on either side, and before long the whole evening was alive with frog-sourced music. I wished that it would never end. There is an Athonite anecdote, typical of the monastic sense of humour, about a group of monks who were celebrating the morning service. The frogs of the cistern outside were making an astonishing noise. So the superior went out of the chapel and said, "Frogs, we've just ended the midnight office and are about to begin matins. Would you mind keeping quiet until we've finished?" Whereupon the frogs replied, "We've just finished matins and we are about to begin the first hour. Would you mind keeping quiet until we've finished?" Having reflected on the natural environment, both inanimate and animate, of the holy mountain of Athos, let us turn our attention to the monks themselves. I'm grateful that on my first visit in 1961, I was in time to see Athos in what may be termed its pre-industrial era. There were at that time virtually no roads suitable for vehicles, and indeed no actual vehicles to use such roads. The Pilgrim, arriving at the port of Daphne, did not find a bus to take him up to the monastic capital of Kallistos. He had to walk. But coming events have cast their shadow before. On my second visit in 1962, I found that a vehicle road from port to capital was under construction. in preparation for the celebration of the Athonite millennium in 1963. In 1961, the only vehicle road was from the Russian monastery of St. Panteleimonos, leading up far above to the woods that belonged to the monastery. The community had a lorry to bring down timber to the harbour. Through the modest sale of this timber, the Russian monks hoped to raise a little money, for their economic position at this time was altogether dire. This road, however, did not connect St. Panteleimonos with any of the other monasteries. And with this one exception, I don't think that in 1961 any monastery possessed a lorry Jeep or Land Rover. And I was told that the Serbian monastery had a tractor donated by Tito, but I never saw it. Alas, today the situation has changed out of all recognition. A network of vehicular roads, many of them ugly gashes across the hillside, now joins all the 20 ruling monasteries to one another, with the sole exceptions, as far as I know, of Grigoriou and Dionysiou, which have, in any case, outlets immediately onto the sea. Vehicles are to be found everywhere. The monks are surprised that I deliberately choose, whenever possible, to walk from one monastery to another, not out of voluntary asceticism, but because of the delight which such walks afford. They consider that this behaviour is unsuitable for a bishop. Other aspects of the pre-industrial era on Athos remain clearly in my memory. There was no electricity, and lighting was provided by oil lamps or candles. An electric system had been installed at Vatopedi in the 1920s or 30s, but when I visited in 1961, it no longer worked. There was no running hot water in the monasteries. It had to be heated on a cauldron, balanced on a primus stove. The monasteries were not connected directly to the outside world by telephone, although there was a primitive and inefficient telephone system joining the monasteries to each other. I believe that this was set up during the German occupation in World War II. It's easy to look back with nostalgia to the days of Athonite oil lamps, but more modern devices certainly have advantages from a practical point of view. There is, after all, nothing intrinsically numinous about primus stoves and oil lamps. Coming to Athos in 1961, all around me I saw evidence of decline. The monks constituted a shrinking and aging population. Everywhere I was surrounded by grey beards, while the few beards that were black stood out as a marked exception. The fall in numbers was by no means new, but it started before World War I. In 1903, there were 7,432 monks, more than half of them non-Greeks. By 1913, the number had dropped to 6,345. This was due mainly to the expulsion of some 800 Russian monks in the course of the dispute concerning glorifiers of the name. Following the 1917 revolution, no more recruits came from Russia, and few Greeks chose to join the Athonite monasteries. In consequence, by 1943, there were only 2,878 monks, and by 1959, the number had fallen to 1,641. A low point was reached in 1971, by which time there were only 1,145. Most of these were over 60 years of age, and so there was every prospect that the decrease would continue. Surprisingly, this did not happen. In 1972, for the first time since 1914, the number of monks actually increased, rising by a figure of 1, from 1,145 to 1,146. This upward movement has steadily continued since then, and today there are perhaps 2,000 monks on the mountain. More importantly, these are not predominantly elderly, but are distributed more or less evenly among the different age groups. Indeed, there are monasteries where it's difficult to discover a grey beard among the serried ranks of black whiskers. Recently, the overall numbers have ceased to grow noticeably. There has, however, been no significant decline. This growth in numbers has been accompanied by a major alteration of spiritual atmosphere in different communities. In almost all the monasteries that I visited during my visits in the 1960s, on a practical level, there was a lack of hope among the monks, an absence of any expectation that the demographic situation would improve. Those with whom I spoke did not doubt that the mountain enjoyed the special blessing of Christ and his mother, but they viewed the future with quiet resignation rather than with any sense of confidence. I remember, for example, a conversation I had in 1968 with Father Evdokios, the senior epitrachos in the monastery of Philothea. It was at that time Idiorithmic. "We are 17 monks here," he said, "but we are mostly old men, and so all the work has to be done by about 3 or 4. I am afraid that Athos will soon become like the monasteries of Egypt, just ruins." In fact, there has been a notable revival of monasticism in the Coptic Church of Egypt, but that is another story. I do not hear any of the Athonite monks speaking today in the way that Father Evdokios did 50 years ago. Today, combined with the quest for inner stillness, there is among the monks a sense of practical purpose, of dynamic energy. Sometimes one hears the phrase, "springtime in the garden of the Panagia," and this aptly describes the prevailing mood. Everywhere buildings are being restored, sometimes, I fear, unwisely. There was a disastrous example some time ago at Diokleia, when a substantial part of the attractive external balconies was destroyed. But at any rate, there are no longer the signs of structural decay that were all too apparent in the 1960s. There is better sanitation in the quarters, both of the monks and of the visitors. There are proper washing facilities with hot water, and there is electric light. In most monasteries, there is a welcome improvement in the cooking. No longer do lukewarm beans form the main staple of the diet, but eggs, green salads, and fresh fruit are usually provided. As for the monks themselves, there has been an evident change in educational level. In 1961, throughout the whole of Athos, I doubt whether more than a dozen monks had received a university education. Today, in virtually every community, there are members with university degrees, not exclusively in theology, but often in subjects such as medicine, law, or politics. And there are a number who have studied outside Greece in various Western centres of learning. Several are authors of substantial doctrinal texts. Some of us, recalling the humble simplicity and the purity of the vision found so notably among the monks of an earlier era, may feel that there has been a certain loss. Needless to say, university education does not necessarily produce good monks. Yet, so long as Athos contained virtually no monks who had pursued higher studies, it was difficult for the mountain to provide the articulate inspiration and leadership that are so greatly needed by the Church at large. One of the most encouraging changes has been in the liturgical worship on Athos. In the 1960s, despite the lack of younger monks, the daily round of services was conscientiously performed in full, but often this was done in a hurried and perfunctory manner. A non-Orthodox visitor said to me in 1961 they performed their worship as a duty, but without joy. I thought this unduly harsh, but I saw his point. Now, however, in almost every monastic house, the outward prayer life is markedly different. The standard of singing is greatly improved. The reading of the psalms is more intelligible. The ceremonial actions are carried out with greater reverence, and there is less talking in church. Most important of all, there has been a decisive revival of frequent communion. When I first visited the mountain in 1961, it was the practice for almost everywhere for the monks to receive the sacrament no more than once every 40 days, that is to say 10 times a year, even though the liturgy was celebrated daily except in Lent. It was also the custom for them to observe before communion a strict fast of 2 or 3 days without any use of oil in cooking. But since oil is allowed on all Saturdays throughout the year, with the sole exception of Holy Saturday, it was the Saturday immediately before Easter, this meant that, apart from Easter Day, the monks never received communion on Sunday, but as a rule on Saturday. This was surely a strange anomaly. On my first visit to Athos, I attended the feast of the Nativity of the Mother of God at the Great Library. If I recall rightly, the feast fell on a Sunday. There was an all-night vigil, with the participation of some 8 priests and 4 deacons. But when we came to the liturgy, this was served by a single priest without a deacon. And at the moment of Holy Communion, out of a congregation of about 150 monks and lay pilgrims, to my astonishment, not a single person came forward to receive the sacrament. I had a sad feeling of anticlimax. Today it's unthinkable that this should happen at a great feast in any of the main Athonite houses. At Metropolitan, for example, it is the norm for lay monks to receive Holy Communion 2 or 3 times a week. And throughout the mountain there has been a true Eucharistic renaissance. What has been the main reason for this increase in the number of monks on the Holy Mountain, and for the renewal of the spiritual and liturgical life? Among the various possible answers, the most significant reason, in my view, has been the presence on Athos over the past 50 years of charismatic elders, yearlings, endowed with the gift of discernment and pastoral guidance. The ministry of the Abba, or Father in God, has been a constant feature of Eastern monasticism in the time of the first monks, such as St. Anthony and St. Macarius of Egypt in the 4th century, up to the present day. But there have been periods of decline, followed by periods of revival. And on Athos, the second half of the 20th century has definitely been a period of revival. Prominent examples and of such charismatic elders from the 1960s onwards are Father Vasilios at Stavronikita and Iviron, Father Emilianos at Simeonopatra, Father George at Grigoriou, and Father Ephraim at Philothea. He has more recently established some 16 monasteries in North America. It's a striking fact that when Athonite monasteries have revived, particularly in houses where the abbot is endowed with the gift of eldership. Today, young people drawn to the mountain, to the monastic life, are attracted not so much by the abbey as by the Abba. They are looking not primarily for a famous house with a distinguished history, but for a personal guide. Spiritual fathers on the Holy Mountain are of course to be found not only in the main monasteries, but in the skeets such as Great and Little Sedans and Capsa Conivia. One such Yerunda in the middle of the 20th century was Father Joseph of Newskeet. He gathered round himself a group of disciples who practiced the Jesus prayer with special devotion. Setting out from Newskeet, his followers have played an important role throughout the mountain and elsewhere. More recently, a greatly revered elder was the hermit Paisios, who was glorified as a saint in 2015. I shall never forget the 2 hours that I spent with him in 1971 when we spoke at length about St. Isaac of Syria. I was greatly struck by his lightness of heart and his spirit of joy. What, finally, has been the contribution of the Holy Mountain to the outside world? Although, as noted above, there are now well-educated monks on Athos who are authors of serious spiritual works, the Holy Mountain is by no means a centre of scholarship, in any way comparable to the Benedictine Moorist congregation in 18th century France. What is said by Father Diokleia of Diokleia, a leading Athonite spokesman in the mid-20th century, is basically true, although somewhat overstated. He wrote, "In the Eastern Church, the existence of the scholar monk is quite unknown. The monk finds no justification under the ascetic and mystical theology that has been developed by the fathers, except as a worker of virtue, as a contemplative soul, called by God, giving to his brethren in Christ because of his love for them, out of the abundance of his experience of the divine. Hence, the cell of the monk is not a room for scholarly research and writing, but a place for prayer, work, meditation, and the tempering of the soul for special spiritual struggles in an unworldly, solitary, quiet region." End of quote. Much more important than scholarship and literary work is the provision of hospitality by the Athonite monasteries. From the earliest beginnings of monasticism, this has been seen in both East and West as an integral part of the monastic vocation. As St. Benedict of Nursia insists in his rule, "Let all guests be received as Christ himself, for he says, 'I was a stranger and you welcomed me.'" Such also is the tradition of the mountain. Abbot Gabriel of Dionysia once said to me, we heard this yesterday, "We divide all the money received by the monastery into 3 equal parts. 1/3 for upkeep of the buildings, 1/3 for the monks, 1/3 for hospitality to visitors and pilgrims." Yet here there is a major difficulty. In the past, the majority of the visitors were genuine pilgrims, and because travel was difficult, their number was relatively restricted. When I stayed for a week at Great Lavra during October 1962, for the whole of that time, I was the only visitor. Today, especially throughout the summer, the main monasteries are all but overwhelmed by a constant influx of visitors. Despite a strict quota system, the numbers are disturbingly large, perhaps nearly 100 each night at the more accessible houses. What is more, most of these visitors are tourists rather than pilgrims. They come to Athos out of curiosity rather than religious devotion. The monks do their best to cope with this incursion, but the inevitable result is that one no longer finds on Athos the stillness and silence that was such an impressive feature of my visits to the mountain 50 years ago. It's only to be expected that those who come to the Holy Mountain as genuine pilgrims are, in many cases, not content simply to attend the church services and to venerate the icons and relics, but they also hope to find monks to whom they can open their hearts and from whose words they can receive healing. This brings us to a second way, alongside hospitality, in which Athonite monasticism serves the Christian community at large. From the very beginning of its history, the mountain has nurtured elders, charismatic guides who can offer spiritual direction. We have already spoken of the crucial role played by these elders in the revival of monastic life on Athos during the past half-century. Not only do these elders provide assistance to the monks permanently resident on the mountain, but they also minister to the many pilgrims who seek them out. But the visitor should not expect that he will easily and casually discover such elders. Often they are hidden. It is of course true that the ministry of eldership is not limited to monks. Spiritual guides are to be found among the married clergy and in monasteries for women as well as men, and likewise among the laity, both men and women. There are many amos as well as abbas. But it can justly be claimed that the mountain, while enjoying no monopoly, is yet to a preeminent degree a centre where such spirit-filled counsellors are to be found. What is it that enables someone to act as a spiritual father or mother? It is above all their entry into the deep mystery of inner prayer. The true Yerona is not merely someone who says prayers from time to time, but someone who is prayer all the time, a living flame of prayer, without interruption, day and night, whether in solitude or in the company of others. And so we come to a third way in which Athos serves the world. Today, as in the past, the Holy Mountain continues to be an oasis of living prayer. I'm not thinking only of intercessory prayer, although this does indeed play a prominent role in the prayer life of the Athonite monk. Yet beyond this, all prayer, not only prayer of intercession and petition, but prayer that is exclusively contemplative, supports and strengthens the Christian community as a whole. Every place where genuine prayer is offered, and par excellence each of the monasteries and hermitages of the mountain, acts as a focal point, a powerhouse of noetic electricity that renders the desert of the secular world less arid and forlorn. This, in the last resort, is the only way in which a monastic centre such as Athos can find its justification and raison d'etre. For those who do not believe in the value of prayer, monastic life on the Holy Mountain will appear futile and pointless, a perverse waste of human talent. But for those who believe that the world is upheld by the prayers of the saints, the mountain is indeed providing a service to the world that is creative and indispensable. The value of the Holy Mountain, and equally of every monastic house of prayer, is well illustrated in a story from 4th century Egypt. When the young Palladios was suffering from discouragement, he went to see his spiritual father, Makarios of Alexandria, and said to him, "Father, what shall I do? For my thoughts afflict me, saying, 'You are making no progress, go away from here.'" Makarios replied, "Tell your thoughts, for Christ's sake, I am guarding the walls. I am guarding the walls. The church is like a city. The monks are sentinels on the walls, keeping watch, so that the other inhabitants of the city can pursue their occupations in safety and security. Against whom are the monks guarding the walls? The monks of Athos have a clear and specific answer. Against the demons, who are the common enemies of humankind. The warfare waged by monks against the forces of evil is thus a battle fought on behalf of every one of us alike. With what weapons do the monks fight? With the weapon of prayer, and beyond that, with the totality of their ascetic dedication and their personal sanctification. Such, in essence, is the way in which the Athonite monk assists the world, not so much by what he does as by what he is, not actively, but existentially, not primarily by preaching, teaching, writing, or by external works of mercy, but by his very existence, by his continual prayer of the heart. Because there are persons of living prayer on the slopes of Mount Athos, our lives, wherever we may be, in North Oxford, in Chelsea or Camden Town, are rendered more stable, more fruitful, more joyful. We are never alone. Let us bless God for our Athonite companions, for the mystical support of our monastic partners and fellow workers. Thank you for your attention. Lots of questions on behalf of the Metropolitan. So it's time for lunch. Time for lunch. Thank you so much. In about 5 minutes I'm going down. 5 minutes.